If you're enjoying the story so far, please subscribe and hit the thumbs up icon. Also, you can hit up the little notification bell. It'll help you stay informed of future content. Doing this will help others to experience this story as well. Without further ado, let's get back into the story. Chapter 4: Darwinian Anarchy. July 8th, Hertzville Metro Penal Colony, 11:11 p.m. In the Daimler Black Star hearse, Connor, Jonas, and Rolf were quiet as they left the roundabout road behind and started heading down Eben Avenue towards the Black District. This was a place known for being very libertarian in the Darwinian sense rather than the peaceful, anarchic sense. Here, one lived as one chose, regardless of any collateral outcomes. It was a place to indulge in illicit vices and behaviors at not only one's own risk, but at the risk of everyone else as well, in a very easy come, easy go, life is cheap kind of way. Those who find themselves on the bad side of politics of either of the ideologically segregated districts would likely find themselves here. These would be the outcasts that even the other outcasts could not tolerate. Along the road were no forms of checkpoint, barrier, or surveillance. There were only signs, written and painted in all manner of ways, from ordinary paint to blood or even feces. Typical messages on signs might read something like, "Live by the sword, die by the sword." "Life sucks, then you die." "Death to authority." "Anarchy." "Trust none, kill all," and the like. It was a true dog-eat-dog kind of world. Jonas spoke, looking at the GPS on his Matic phone. Officer Dredge has provided a map of the area with location markers. 8 more miles until the nav point. Entire blocks of buildings owned by various factions or individuals were cordoned off into zones with fences, gates, pikes, and pits. The car crept along at about 40 miles per hour, the lights off. Except for where there were fires or lanterns, the city was pitch black. Even the view screens on the plate ceiling had been destroyed and no longer broadcasted a day or night sky. During the day, one could see the smashed screens, but at night, there was only darkness. The Black District had been named after the profound lack of light caused by tall buildings and the destruction of the electrical grid, leading to the blackest of nights and very dismal-looking days. Even in the middle of the sunniest day, there was no more light than typical late dusk elsewhere. Things typically bothered by sunlight need hardly ever worry about that sort of thing here. Wherever there were gaps between buildings, the denizens had erected great tarps to cover the gaps, disallowing direct sunlight from reaching most places. Jonas and Rolf wore night vision goggles, but Connor was able to drive in the complete darkness with his natural vision and hearing. Connor and Rolf were watching the front and sides while Jonas watched for rearward threats. It would take a little over 16 minutes to reach their destination, and in that amount of time, anything could happen. Every now and again, Connor would take a turn onto another road, varying his approach to the target. His pointed ears were twitching and he took deep breaths through his nose, listening and smelling his way through the streets as a form of navigation. Agent Luger leaned a bit towards Connor. How we doing there, dead man?" Connor glanced over his shoulder for a moment, then returned his gaze to the road, and said, "I believe we should expect trouble when we get there." Jonas shimmied closer to the front seat, keeping his gaze still out the rear window, then inquired in a semi-whispering tone, "On the way, or at the jump house?" Connor squinted slightly, then answered, "Homo sapiens controlled the pumping station and wield a significant advantage in doing so. The Lycans would love nothing more than to nullify that advantage, and tonight is a full moon. An engagement is highly likely." Rolf sighed a bit. "Why are the bloodsuckers and beastie boys always fighting? Isn't there enough food for everyone?" Connor raised an eyebrow and answered, "Did your species not also eliminate its own evolutionary rivals when the hominids were driven to extinction? It is no different for vampires and werebeast." Jonas did a half chuckle, half harumph. I appreciate you using your dumb guy speak for us. There was a loud thunk as something slammed into the roof of the hearse, denting it significantly and smashing out most of the car's side glass. Jonas was facing rearward, nearly pinned between the bench seat and the newly lowered roof. Rolf reached down to the go bag he had grabbed before leaving the garage. Before Rolf could open it, Connor said, "Glove box." Rolf opened the glove box to see what Connor was pointing to. Meanwhile, Jonas had to wiggle his way out of the awkward spot he was in to get to his own weaponry. The sound of nails on metal screeched across the roof of the car. Rolf grabbed the sawn-off shotgun from the glove box and leaned out the passenger window. He peeked above the roof just enough to get a glimpse of a massive, hairy creature, then leaned back just as a clawed hand swiped at his face. He raised the shotgun in his left hand and fired off a shot in the direction that the clawed hand had come from. Blue flames burst from the barrel along with shot and spray. A great shriek came from the roof, followed by the creature rolling off the back and onto the road. "What the fuck was that?" Rolf exclaimed. Connor answered, "Dragon's breath, with holy oil." Jonas was on the floor getting his bag to retrieve his special ammo. He informed Connor with, "I think he meant the thing on the fucking roof." Connor kept his composure as calm as always and answered, "Lycan. Expect more, as well as their rivals. Both are likely to be hostile to us, especially outside of the pumping station itself." They had scantly driven a few more seconds before Connor's ears twitched and his nose crinkled. "Get down," he commanded in a stern voice, ducking himself. As Rolf and Jonas lowered their heads, a stream of bullets shattered what was left of the window glass and continued for several seconds. Rolf grabbed a modern-looking pistol out of his bag, slapped in a clip of ammo labeled Omni, took off his night vision goggles, leaned out the passenger window, and took aim rearward. The pupil of his right eye turned blue for a moment, then Rolf squeezed the trigger. In the distance, a car went off-road and crashed. There were no lights or shapes to see, but the cars could be heard. By this time, the hearse and its pursuers had gained significant speed as Connor leaned into the throttle. Jonas had by this time assembled a rifle from his bag and was set up to aim out the rear window. He fired a shot out into the dark. The shot rang and echoed through the buildings, followed by the sound of a car horn, then a crash a few seconds later. Another storm of bullets ripped through the windows, but did not penetrate the heavily plated body panels of the car. The hearse would gain ground on every straight road with its massive power, but would lose ground on some turns, since it had narrow front tires and did not corner all that swiftly. Connor called out, "More Lycans." Jonas asked a question between exchanges of gunfire. "How can you tell?" Connor answered back, "Other than smell? Lycans want your flesh, not your blood, so they do not mind poking holes in you." Connor spoke again. "Agent Luger, we should switch places." "Right," Rolf responded. With that, Connor swiftly became a cloud of mist, while Rolf scooched over to the driver's side to take the wheel. Rolf could drive with more skill than Connor could muster, and Connor could produce more effective offensive power. Connor rematerialized a few seconds later, grabbing onto the passenger side of the bar supporting the roof rack. He slinked up swiftly and crouched in the huge dent in the roof while Rolf took the controls. Rolf was able to squeeze a bit more speed out of the car, especially in braking and cornering. With his natural vision, Connor could make out several cars following behind. After dodging a barrage of gunfire on the roof, and just as the next corner was being navigated, Connor stood and held out his hands in a strange posture while speaking words in a seemingly unintelligible language. After a couple of seconds, a bolt of lightning flew from one of Connor's fingertips, striking the closest car, then leaping to several others, frying the electrical systems in the cars struck. The hearse was now on a long stretch of twisting road, constantly squealing its tires through each corner. A large, armored personnel carrier was creeping up from behind, as the hearse was actually slower through the turns. This large truck was full of Lycans with guns, as well, and stood some chance of getting close enough to be within firing range. Connor yelled down to Rolf. Keep it steady as you can. I'll try. These circumstances ain't ideal, Rolf shouted back. Connor stood up straight, digging his boots into the space under the luggage bars to secure himself. He put his arms out straight, made a pair of finger guns, pointed them down and together, then joined his thumbs together, making a diamond shape with his hands. He held this posture and chanted. A bullet ripped through his coat, but he didn't flinch. Then another struck him in the left shoulder, but he still kept chanting and holding his position. The material of his jacket was not even pierced. Just as he finished the much longer incantation, a bullet struck him square in the forehead, knocking him down into the big dent in the roof, but not penetrating his skull. At the same time, a number of faint red and orange lights appeared above and between the positions of the two vehicles. A shower of meteors came crashing down from above, pulverizing the truck and its riders from above as the truck crossed into the area of effect. At least 50 flaming meteors struck the truck, mangling it and setting it on fire. A few seconds later, the truck exploded as Connor looked to the sky, letting out a sigh of relief. He squinted in some pain as the welt on his forehead healed and returned to normal. Connor grabbed the roof rack again and swung himself back down into the front passenger seat. No more vehicles followed, though a few who were behind the truck did come screeching to a stop, turned around, and retreated. A few minutes later, just about a mile from their destination, they came upon a roadblock, consisting of trucks, with persons in the beds and standing around them. Their faces were pale, their eyes glowed red in the darkness, and they were armed, some with rifles, some with pistols, and others with close-quarters weaponry. They wore ordinary but shabby-looking clothing, with the exception of each wearing a black leather jacket. The roadblock extended beyond the shoulders of the road in either direction. There was no other road to where the three were needing to get, so Rolf brought the car to a stop about 60 feet from the roadblock. Connor spoke softly. Disengage the ignition. Rolf chuckled nervously. You sure about that? Connor nodded affirmatively. With a simultaneous nod, Rolf turned the engine off. Both Rolf and Connor slowly opened the car doors and stepped out, making no sudden movements. Connor kept his hands up as Rolf kept his weapon trained on the ground, while Jonas watched through the windshield area and through the scope of his rifle from the back of the car. Connor spoke first. We wish to negotiate passage. The cluster of 20 or so vampires all looked at each other, then started to laugh. They parted down the middle as a menacing figure approached from behind the group of vampires. He stood about a foot and a half taller than the rest of the group and wore all black clothing, with a purple stripe down the center of the jacket and along the pant legs. His hair was silver and went down to his waist. Unlike other vampires, his eyes glowed purple. The tall and imposing leader of the group spoke in a deep tone with a slight reverberation. You don't seem to have much negotiating power, especially considering that there are only one of you. Or are you so docile and weak that you have made friends with your food? Rolf Luger muttered, Holy shit. Rolf started tapping the side of his rifle with a finger, but Connor held his hand up in a manner to suggest waiting a moment. He took 2 steps forward, hands still in the air, then reached back to the epaulettes of his shoulders and long coat and lifted them slightly. Like a scrolling shade, the back of his coat grew out from the collar, longer and longer, forming a long black cape with gold trim. It appeared as though stars and galaxies were contained within the cape itself, or at least it seemed to be a very convincing image of such. With a nearly imperceivable whisper, Connor reached down to the cape as the hilt of his sword emerged from inside it. From it, he slowly drew a Nodachi-style sword named Starlight, black as night and with a light blue hue, and a red water-drop-shaped gem in the hilt. He held it in front of himself in a steady position. As he drew the sword, the entire environment became illuminated as though under moonlight on a clear night, and the image of a night sky could be seen above, despite being under the plate. With narrow eyes and a stern look, Connor's pupils turned red, and he bared his own fangs, then made a sound like that of a lion's roar. Connor Greenleaf spoke. You will let us through. Whether you're able to see tomorrow or not is up to you. The tall leader opposite him burst into maniacal laughter. I do not fear the clan of the Blood Tear. We, Necrocidius, are the next evolutionary step, and the rightful rulers of this pitiful chunk of rock. The humans are ours to consume. Those not loyal to the new order are worthy only of extinction. One of the vampires, holding a machete, ran from the back of the group, raising his weapon, charging towards the three. A flash of fire came from the back of the hearse, immediately followed by a loud bang that echoed all throughout the area. As some of the large group flinched, the vampire with the machete gasped and spat up some blood as an inch-thick rod was now lodged into his heart with a specially designed set of protrusions to keep it from going all the way through. He dropped the machete, took one step, and fell onto his face. Jonas loaded a second rod as quickly as he could. The Necrocidius shouted, "Go!" The remaining vampires sprung into action to take down the three. Rolf narrowly dodged as gunfire erupted in his direction. The hearse was parked at an angle, so the armor plating and engine block could provide protection. The Necrocidius stayed in his position as the vampires advanced. Connor rushed forward with the Nodachi, severing an approaching vampire in half at the waist, while simultaneously blocking a couple of incoming bullets with the flat of the blade. With a second motion, he planted the sword tip first into the chest of the vampire, who had become half the man he used to be, as it wailed in agony, then succumbed to the second, more lethal wound. Connor Greenleaf moved intermittently as though he were under a strobe light. His normal speed was incredibly fast, like that of an elite martial artist, but whenever he engaged his ability for surges of speed, one could see only the starting and ending points of his movement. Anything in between was a blur at best. 1, 2, and then 3 vampires who came into close quarters were cut down, one after the other, all beheaded swiftly with a flash of action. The beheaded vampires transformed into mist, unable to hold physical form until they could find a safe place to rest for a sufficient amount of time. The other vampires were incredibly fast too, but their speed paled in comparison to that of this Nodachi wielder. A second rod was fired from the back of the hearse, going straight into a vampire's forehead. 5 were defeated and several others had turned into mist, possibly to gain better positioning. Suddenly, the clamshell rear door of the hearse was ripped open, and something grabbed Jonas' ankle before he could even react. Jonas lifted a leg to strike at it as he was yanked backwards towards his attacker. With a swift kick to the face, the lady vampire that had grabbed his ankle was knocked back a bit, but did not lose her grip. She opened her mouth, revealing sharp fangs, and lunged forward to bite Jonas's neck. Jonas managed to block by jamming his forearm into her throat, while at the same time reaching down to the knife in his boot. With a quick flick of the knife, he jammed it into the side of her neck, only to get smashed in the face by the back of her hand. The knife was coated in silver powder, but it would take a moment to get into her bloodstream. Somewhat dazed, Jonas managed to retain the knife, and some blood spurted out of the vampire's wound, but it quickly healed up within a few seconds. Jonas swiftly rolled out of the back of the car and took a combat-ready stance. Seeing the potential for a strike, he lunged forward with the knife, only to be deflected with the block, and was then struck in the face with a fist and knocked to the ground. Opening his eyes, Jonas found himself on his belly, just out of reach of his knife. He reached for it, only to have his hand stepped on by a high-heeled shoe. He yelled in pain, but got to his knees, then flicked out a foot with a sweeping motion, knocking the lady vampire off her feet and onto her side. The lady vampire was slowing down under the influence of the silver poison in her blood. She started to move to get up, but before she could, Jonas had reclaimed the knife and had grabbed hold of her from behind. Holding her by the hair from behind, he jabbed the knife into her neck again, then started sawing away vigorously. The silver powder had poisoned her blood sufficiently so that she could no longer transform, regenerate, or use any other powers. Blood sprayed everywhere as she howled until finally her head was off her shoulders. The sounds of gunfire and clashing weaponry continued as Jonas momentarily regained his composure, taking a few frantic breaths covered in vampire blood from the shoulders to the waist. Connor was at the forefront of the encounter and was able to deflect most of what was thrown at him. Rolf continued to take pot shots from behind the car with a shotgun, which had the dragon's breath and holy oil ammunition. Seemingly from out of nowhere, the shotgun was grabbed away, just in time for Rolf to look up and see it get broken in half in the hands of a particularly bulky vampire. Tossing the broken gun aside, the vampire lashed out, just grazing Rolf's jacket and armored vest with his sharp claws. Rolf, taking a few steps back and going into an evasive roll out of reach of another swipe, reached into his belt holster and pulled out what looked to be a long knife. With the flick of a mechanical switch, it telescoped out into a 3-foot sword. The vampire seemed to be either amazed or amused with what was happening, up until the point where the tip and half the length of the blade produced reciprocating bladelets, like that of a meat-carving knife. The vampire's face went from an expression of curiosity to something more closely resembling shock and awe. Rolf smiled sadistically and grunted out the words, "Turkey time." The target vampire was armed with a metallic baseball bat, and once over the shock of seeing his opponent produce a giant meat knife, ran straight in to engage the fight. As Rolf blocked the first blow, a second vampire came in from his right flank, wielding a metal pole that struck Rolf in his armored chest. It stunned him for a split second and sent him staggering back. After that, Rolf held the meat sword up, smiled, and made the come-hither gesture as he squared himself against the now two opponents. They traded vicious blows, dodging and blocking as Rolf held his own against two vampires. The first vampire to make a mistake would get carved up like a holiday roast. Meanwhile, two more vampires were split in half by Connor's Nodachi, one vertically and the other horizontally, both of whom became mist, unable to take other forms without being completely vulnerable until rested. Seeing that his forces were fairly outmatched, the Necrosidius reached into the back of the nearby pickup truck and grabbed a heavy iron crowbar of the large sort used to pry up heavy rocks. He flailed it around fancifully with great skill. Seeing nothing else between himself and Connor, he engaged in the battle. Holding the iron bar from the center at first, the Necrosidius flicked the weapon outward, extending its rage in a wide, swooping arc. The sweeping blow made a whooshing sound like wind blowing across the top of a bottle. Connor narrowly ducked the blow and countered with his Nodachi, only to be blocked in return. A blow could be deflected, then one of them would step back, then charge back in, both with immense bursts of speed that could hardly be perceived by a human eye, each trying to get the drop on the other. Clangs, bashes, and whooshes went along with the frantic pace of two supernaturally strong martial masters trying to kill the other with close-quarters combat tactics straight out of a medieval textbook. The style of the Necrosidius was brutish but accurate, while that of the opponent was graceful and swift, but no less deadly. A wild blow from the Necrosidius' polearm struck Connor in the temple, knocking him violently through the windshield of a nearby vehicle. The Necrosidius laughed to himself, closing in to make the killing blow when his back was pierced and a blade protruded from his chest. The Necrosidius found himself confused to see Connor's leg sticking out of a windshield, while simultaneously seeing Connor's face out the corner of his eye. Pushing the blade in all the way to the hilt, Connor whispered into the Necrosidius' ear, "All of those evolutionarily advanced senses, and you still cannot see through a simple illusion." With a violent yank, Connor pulled the sword from his opponent's back, spilling purple blood and some flesh, grabbed him by the shoulder, spun him in place, then rammed the sword through his chest into his heart. Connor lifted the Necrosidius above his head, then thrust the blade into the bed of the nearby truck, pinning the creature to the bed, still alive, but very much paralyzed. Connor reached into his jacket pocket as Rolf and Jonas finished the other foes. He retrieved a bottle of liquid with a holy symbol on it, popped the cork, and dumped the liquid all over the Necrosidius' chest and into his open mouth. With a few words and a pointing finger, a gout of flame erupted from Connor's hand, causing the holy oil-covered foe to burst into flames. It twitched for several seconds, then evaporated into dust and ash, letting out a horrific scream. The three had a quick look around to make sure everyone else was okay. That shit was crazy, Jonas said in a half mumble. Rolf looked over his shoulder to Jonas. Beats watching football. Connor retrieved Starlight from the bed of the truck, then hopped out. He put the sword back into his cloak, and with a touch of one finger caused the Starlight cloak to recede back into the jacket. He knelt down slightly at the rear bumper, picked it up, and pivoted it enough to move it out of the way, using only one arm, then did the same for the big old car on the opposite side. Before they left, Connor got into the back of the car and braced his back against the dented-in roof. With a mighty heave, he popped most of the dent back out by exerting pressure with his legs just above the car's two thick frame rails. With the roadblock cleared, they got back into the vehicle and continued down the road towards the water pumping station, with Connor driving again, Rolf in the passenger side front seat, and Jonas laying down in the back with his eyes keeping watch out the back window. Rolf seemed to be in his thoughts for a moment, as were the others, but then he asked, "Why aren't we using our agency passes, or any of the usual channels?" Jonas glanced backward for a couple seconds, then returned his eyes to the rear of the vehicle. "The agency has a mole, and no one is sure who it is. Till they figure that out, we use only backwater and more covert channels, so as to avoid the prying eyes of those who might try to interfere or otherwise compromise our mission." Rolf nodded at that and replied, "Whatever you say, asshole." Connor looked perturbed, squinted some, and said, "Do not make me turn this car around and give you both a spanking." Both Jonas and Rolf burst out laughing at such commentary coming from one who seemed to be so stodgy so much of the time. Under other circumstances, most members of Matic would be able to use fake credentials to navigate the various warring factions. With the presence of an eternal risk, they would instead be forced to break out of the Hertzville Metro Penal Colony the most dangerous way, through force. Matic agents normally traveled to and from the penal colony, and some even made it their residence while not on duty. This was a new threat to them and their mission. Their charter was to protect the planet against threats it could not handle otherwise. This used to be done, though in secret, with cooperation with several governments. But, ever since the arrival of the Necrosidius and the resulting chaos of propaganda and war that was tearing the planet apart, Matic had to go completely underground. There was, as of yet, no answer to the global threat of the Necrosidius, who manipulated and set people against each other from behind the shadows, all for the cause of securing a new planetary source of food. The Necrosidius were related to vampires, genetically, but shared very few of the same values, looking down on ordinary vampires as a genus worth only of passing from existence. Unlike vampires, who drink blood, the Necrosidius instead drain neural energy through simple contact, causing cellular necrosis. With the humans so distracted by ideology and politics, the Necrosidius could move behind the scenes without risking exposure to a united front, secretly controlling all information from the shadows, creating a world of ideological slavery in which one can fully expect to either die in war, in a gulag, in a prison, or to just disappear, never to be seen again, likely as food for a Necrosidius. The best way to escape the penal colony would be through the old tunnels underneath the water pumping station. Whoever controls the penal colony's water supply could exert a great amount of power and influence from within. Naturally, any faction within the penal colony would love to get control of this valuable asset. For now, an independent faction of vampires was in control of the pumping station, and the three would have to go through them in order to escape.